We are honored to have Professor Henry J. Abraham with us in our midst. He's the foremost expert on American constitutional law. For the last 27 years, he's been at the University of Virginia. Currently, he is the James Hart Professor Emeritus of Government and Foreign Affairs at the university. His book on the Supreme Court include The Judicial Process, Freedom and the Court, and also Justice, Presidents, and Senators. He has 7 other books covering topics such as law, government, and democracy. And as is reported, maybe we'll talk about, he's one of the few non-lawyers to even be mentioned as a possible nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court. Randy mentioned that there are just a few left of the books, Justices, Presidents, and Senators, which have been authored by Professor Abraham. One of the reviewers, a Professor Watson from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, on reviewing this, said, "It was recently my pleasure to reacquaint myself with Henry Abraham's work in his 4th edition of the History of Appointments to the United States Supreme Court. His style is easily accessible for students, the reading public, and scholars alike." He concluded this by simply saying, "My strongest regret regarding this work is that I'm not the author, for it promises to enhance interest and understanding in the appointment process and in the court itself. There is nothing else out there like it, and there doesn't need to be." He also wrote a book which is used normally in the law schools called The Judicial Process. The reviewer, this is when a gentleman from the University of California, Irvine, said Henry Abraham's The Judicial Process is one of the few political science textbooks to achieve true classic status. Now in its 4th decade and 7th edition, it has never been effectively challenged on the market. The book's remarkable success must be partly due to scope, delivering a historically rich, institutionally centered overview of the judiciary in multiple contexts. This guy's a class act. He's been listed in just about every who's who there is, who's who in the world, who's who in America, who's who of everything else. I won't bore you, but it goes on and on and on. Henry Abraham earned his bachelor's degree in political science, summa cum laude, from Kenyon College, where he graduated first in his class in 1948. His master's degree in public law and government from Columbia University in 1949, and his doctorate in political science from the University of Pennsylvania in 1952. He's received honorary degrees from Kenyon, University of Hartford, Knox College, St. Joseph's University, and Old Dominion. Professor Abraham served in the United States Army in the United States and Western and Central Europe from 1943 to 1946. He received 2 battle stars and the Commendation Medal. We also talked during lunch today about the fact that his career path took him towards matters which assisted for Justice Jackson at Nuremberg, another story. Professor Abraham's family and friends set up a fund to create a speakers bureau at the University of Virginia. And in April of this year, the speaker is a guy named Rehnquist. Now, serendipity is such that I know that Chief Justice Rehnquist has 2 speaking engagements this spring. One in April at the University of Virginia, and one in May here, of which we are honored to have him speak, which just so happens to be, I think, his last public speech before the end of the term, which has some significance because at the end of the term is if there was going to be any announcement whatsoever regarding his career, it usually would come at that time. Now, I'm not suggesting anything will occur. However, Professor Abraham and I have 2 bites at the apple that there might be some excitement. I could go on and on with his resume, but we're here to hear him, and without any further ado, Professor Henry Abraham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterson. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson have been excellent hosts, very thoughtful. Community Foundation has been very thoughtful too in extending some of its information to me via some very intriguing literature aspects. And I might say that in Charlottesville, we also have a community foundation that does similar work. And New York governor, at the Democratic National Convention and following Roosevelt's nomination, campaigned on behalf of the Democratic ticket throughout his home state. After the election, Roosevelt advisors urged Jackson to accept a government position with the new administration in Washington. Although he chose not to do so immediately, he became well known as a supporter of its many reform and recovery measures. By 1934, Jackson had changed his mind. At the urging of a number of prominent administration officials, he accepted the post of General Counsel of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, his first official New Deal assignment. From that time on, Jackson was to advise the president in various aspects of pending and completed federal legislation. His ringing public defense of the New Deal tax program brought him close to the heart of the New Deal philosophy. Subsequently, Jackson was named to head the government's antitrust division of the Justice Department as an Assistant Attorney General. During the riveting 1936-1937 court-packing Supreme Court battle, Jackson aligned himself with the side of the administration, though I am personally convinced that he would not have embraced it had he been on the court during that period. His strong spirit, coupled with his brilliant oratory and dedicated service, led Walter Lippmann to state that of the younger men who have come to Washington under President Roosevelt, the Assistant Attorney General, Robert H. Jackson, is surely one of the ablest and most engaging. Here is a man who has knowledge, resourcefulness, and ardor for his cause. When Solicitor General Stanley Reed was appointed as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in 1938, the President went directly to Jackson to fill Reed's former position. Incidentally, Reed and Jackson were two of the last three justices never to have completed law school. Jimmy Burns was the third. It was not until 1957, ladies and gentlemen, that the Supreme Court of the United States consisted of 9 people who had finished law school completely. So many of you were born, I know I was, many of you were born prior to 1957, so it isn't all that long ago. The Assistant Attorney General's legal and administrative experience, talents, and ideological affinity with the philosophy of the New Deal was second to none. As Solicitor General, Robert Jackson enhanced his already considerable reputation and record, and when FDR sent a reluctant Attorney General Frank Murphy to what Holmes is fond of calling Mount Olympus to replace the deceased Pierce Butler, one of the 2 remaining ultra-conservatives on the court, he appointed Jackson as Reed's successor as the government's first lawyer, namely Attorney General. Murphy, ex-mayor of Detroit and governor of both the Philippines and Michigan, had not been a happy camper as Attorney General. He was neither an interested nor a conscientious administrator. He paid little heed to the modus operandi of his department. He placed heavy emphasis on antitrust legislation and litigation, while neglecting such crucial areas as internal revenue. And like most attorneys general before and after him, he did not get along well, or not at all, with that powerful head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. In view of Frank Murphy's other qualifications and his abiding commitment to civil rights and liberties, FDR quite conceivably decided to expedite his promotion and to give the job to the man who was supposed to get it in the first place, Solicitor General Robert H. Jackson. Quote, "Bob, I suppose you know that you're to come into this office," Murphy had told Jackson on one occasion, adding, "I'm only here temporarily, I know." On June the 2nd, 1941, the great Charles Evans Hughes, in his 80th year, advised FDR of his intention to retire from the Chief Justiceship and the court on July the 1st. He had served admirably in the center chair and as an associate justice, by the way, from 1910 to 1916, during 11 very difficult years. Roosevelt, with already 5 of his appointees on the court, and a 6th one certain to be approved by the heavily Democratic Senate, was in no hurry to find a successor, but Hughes and his colleagues implored him not to delay, and the now third-term president acquiesced. It was widely and correctly assumed that his choice lay between two eminent lawyers, Associate Justice Harlan F. Stone, the only Republican then on the court, and Attorney General Robert H. Jackson, both from the Empire State. FDR's heart was clearly with fellow Democrat Jackson, a New Deal loyalist of long standing, who had fought alongside him all the way, both philosophically and personally. Moreover, he had more than once mentioned the Chief Justiceship to Jackson, who had made clear to his president that he wanted the position very much indeed. Still, FDR hesitated, being acutely aware that a professional groundswell was about to arise for Stone. He called Hughes to the White House to discuss his successor. The retiring Chief Justice immediately volunteered that Stone's record gave him first claim on the honor. Hughes also approved Jackson's candidacy, but stuck to his preference based on Stone's judicial performance. Roosevelt later conferred with Justice Frankfurter and asked him point blank which of the two men he would prefer as Chief Justice. Wishing FDR had not asked that question, Frankfurter, never at a loss for words, replied, quote, "On personal grounds, I prefer Bob. While I've known Stone longer and our relations are excellent and happy, I feel closer friendship with Bob. But from the national interest, I'm bound to say that there's no reason for preferring Bob to Stone. Quite the contrary. Stone is senior and qualified professionally to be Chief Justice. But for me, the decisive consideration, considering the fact that Stone is qualified, is that Bob is of your personal and political family, as it were, while Stone is a Republican. When war does come, and Frankfurter was convinced it would come, and he did, the country should feel you are a national, the nation's president, and not a partisan president. Few things would contribute as much to confidence in you as a national and not a partisan president than for you to name a Republican, who incidentally was the only Republican on the court at the time, who has the profession's confidence as Chief Justice. The president did not commit himself, but Felix Frankfurter was fairly confident that the choice would be Stone, and so he informed his fellow Associate Justice. A few days later, FDR discussed the matter with Jackson, explaining the persuasiveness of Frankfurter's logic, and again assured his Attorney General that he would send him to the court in due course. Jackson concurred fully with Frankfurter and received the President's permission to advise Stone himself. Not many years later, after he had become a member of the court, Jackson would write that the need for judicial leadership and the desirability for a symbol of stability as well as of progress were evidently the reasons for the initially Coolidge-appointed Stone's elevation in the interest of the fostering of the judiciary as an institution. A nationwide chorus of praise and acclaim greeted Stone's nomination on June the 12th, 1941. The press was ecstatic, the judiciary delighted, the intellectual community reassured, Congress happy. When the nomination officially reached the floor of the Senate on June the 27th, he was confirmed viva voce without a single objection. Harlan Fiske Stone was now almost 69 when he succeeded using the center chair, the oldest Chief Justice appointee to date. He would live only for not quite 5 years longer, but although those years proved far less satisfactory, less happy than his 16 years as Associate Justice, they did not deter the experts from ranking him as one of the great jurists on the highest bench. Yet he was clearly more comfortable in being a member of the team than in leading it. Not a first-rate administrator like Taft, not a skillful and disciplinary courtmaster like Hughes, not a ruthless craftsman like Marshall, not so persuasive as Tawney, not so beautiful a writer as Jackson, not so innovative cum activist as Warren, Stone was reluctant to crack down and averse to do battle with warring factions, thus contributing to a marked divisiveness on the court during his Chief Justiceship, led by a prolonged and nasty feud between Black and Jackson over ambitions to become Chief Justice, over questions of recusal from participating in cases, and Jackson's absence in Nuremberg. Moreover, Stone disdained the routine of administrative detail that he now found incumbent upon him. Yet there were precious few who understood and followed the commands and restraints of the Constitution, who supported the essence of limited government, who enhanced the concept of popular government under law, who furthered respect for and a liberal interpretation of the Bill of Rights as fully as Chief Justice Stone did. As he could not be groom, Robert H. Jackson would be best man, and it was to no one's surprise that the 49-year-old Attorney General was selected to fill the vacancy created by the Stone promotion. His appointment took a while longer to be approved than had been anticipated, chiefly because of the opposition of Senator Millard E. Tydings, Democratic senator from Maryland, who was unhappy with Jackson ever since Jackson had refused to prosecute columnist Drew Pearson for publishing an alleged libel against the powerful and proud legislator. But the Judiciary Committee unanimously approved Jackson after about a few minutes' deliberations, and the Senate confirmed him on July the 11th with only one dissenting vote, and that was Millard Tydings. Jackson was eminently qualified to serve on the court. Although he had not had a single day of judicial experience, and although his former legal training had been meager, he passed the New York bar exams without having graduated from law school. He achieved a reputation as a brilliant private and public lawyer in upstate New York, where he had built a lucrative practice and become active in democratic politics, as I mentioned earlier. He attained early national exposure as a close ally of Roosevelt when the latter was governor of New York, and he was an effective campaigner for FDR at the Democratic National Convention as well as during the election of 1932. Initially, as I pointed out, he refused to follow his friend and idol to Washington, but ultimately he yielded and accepted Roosevelt's appointment as general counsel of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. A vigorous defender of and spokesman for the New Deal programs, including, as I said, the court package, Jackson began a rapid climb through sundry posts, notably in the Department of Justice. Beginning as Assistant Attorney General in the Antitrust Division, he succeeded to the Solicitor Generalship, where he did so well in his role as the government's lawyer that Justice Brandeis, as I indicated at the outset, was moved to comment Jackson should be Solicitor General for life, and then to the Attorney Generalship. In his post, he combined hard work and expertise with persuasiveness, charm, and a superb, elegant command of the English language. Now, as to his place in the eyes of those who have evaluated the court. An examination of how members of the Supreme Court have been ranked or rated by informed court watchers points to the complexity of establishing agreed-upon criteria. Yet it also indicates a remarkable degree of agreement, which is especially noteworthy given the subjectivity of judgments based on elusive criteria. One of the first formal professional attempts to organize an evaluation of the performance of the first 96 individuals through Justice Thurgood Marshall was designed by law professors Blaustein and Mirsky of Rutgers and Texas, respectively. Enlisting 65 law school deans and professors of law, history, and political science, of whom I was privileged to be one, the project asked each participant, all of whom were presumed to be experts on the court and its personnel, to grade each of the 96 justices on a continuum from great, that was an A, through near great, a B, average C, below average D, and failures E. Other than these 5 categories, neither criteria, nor yardstick, nor measuring rods were provided to the participants to assist in making the appraisals. We were left to our own judgment devices with the self-perceived parameters of those 5 adjectives, although we were invited to provide supplementary explanatory remarks. The undertaking, published in 1978 in a book form by the co-authors of the project, produced 12 great justices, 15 near greats, 55 average, 6 below average, and 8 failures. Only one, Chief Justice Marshall, received all 65 votes under the rubric of great. Next came Justice Brandeis with 62, followed in third place by Justice Holmes with 61. Justice Black was a distant fourth with 42. The remaining 8 of the 12 ranked as grade were in chronological order: Story, Tawney, Harlan the First, Hughes, Stone, Cardozo, Frankfurter, and Warren. Professor Mirsky, joined by attorney William David Bader, undertook a second evaluation in which I again participated, to be published in late 2003, and there may be some changes. Despite the amorphousness and disputability of the notion of greatness in a justice, a century ago, Chief Justice Horace Gray of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts deliberately used the adjective great to characterize John Marshall as the greatest judge in the language. Those categorized as such by the 65 raters had, in their considered judgment, made significant, readily recognizable, indeed seminal contributions to the development or identification of constitutional law. There was wide agreement that such a mark of greatness on the Supreme Court was, as Blaustein and Mirsky put it well several years later, the combined result of several qualities: scholarship, legal learning and analytical powers, craftsman and technique, wide general knowledge and learning, character, moral integrity and impartiality, diligence and industry, the ability to express oneself orally with clarity, logic, and compelling force, openness to change, courage to take unpopular decisions, dedications to the court as an institution and to the office of Supreme Court Justice, ability to carry a proportionate share of the court's responsibility in opinion writing, and finally, the quality of statesmanship. Now, one may grant that greatness is not quantifiable, yet the evidence is persuasive that the term or concept is not only a meaningful one in the eyes of qualified observers of the judicial function at its apex, but there is something akin to consensus among them. Observers who represent the gamut of the socio-political and professional spectrum. Those at the seat of power of the nominating and appointing process will, in other words, be in a position to opt for merit. Should the decision be for something less than that, as has been indubitably true from time to time, that, of course, is attainable too. Although it is impossible to foretell future on-bench performance, as many presidents have found out, often to their chagrin and sometimes to their delight, an established record and profile of potential appointees is assuredly not unattainable. Simply to brush off clarion calls for merit-based appointments on the grounds of eye of the beholder is at best a crude oversimplification and at worst intellectually dishonest. It is noteworthy that 13 years earlier than the first described project, Justice Felix Frankfurter offered his list of greats. Even so precise a linguist as he offered no substitute for that categorization on the occasion of a celebrated address at the University of Pennsylvania, which he entitled Supreme Court in the Mirror of Justices. He excluded all those appointed after 1932, and thus 3 FDR appointees who would be listed as great in the Blaustein and Murphy rankings, namely Black, FF himself, and Stone, plus the 1 Eisenhower appointee, Warren. Frankfurter's rather more generous roster comprised the other grades from the Blaustein and Mirsky group, to which he added 11. It was indeed generous. William Johnson, Curtis, Campbell, Miller, Field, Bradley, Matthews, Brewer, Brown, E.D. White, and Moody, of whom 6, W. Johnson, Curtis, Miller, Field, Bradley, and E.D. White, would be rated near grade in the 1970s study, and the other 5 average. 4 years after FF's list, Judge Jerome Frank, another ardent Supreme Court scholar observer, issued this list of rank perceptions, a somewhat longer one, but it also excluded all post-1932 appointees. The Frank's top list included, as had Frankfurter's, all of the pre-1932 grades designated by the Blaustein and Mirsky poll, and it comprised all of Frankfurter's additional 11 except Matthews, Brown, and E.D. White, none of whom, it will be recalled, had been among the 12 grades of the first enlightenment. That there is indeed a rather wide general index of agreement on what constitutes greatness on the court in terms of its individual members, in terms of in terms of those members, is demonstrated by several considerably more recent roster polls, for example in 78, 79, and 83, relying on court experts. As had the aforementioned earlier ones and some others in the interim, they patently confirmed the now evidently well-established and recognized roster of greats. That evidence prompted the American Bar Association to publish its authoritative list in a gaily colored article in 1983 entitled "The All-Time All-Star All-Era Supreme Court." Its Supreme Court 9 of greats comprised, in chronological order, John Marshall, Story, Tawney, Holmes, Hughes, Brandeis, Cardozo, Black, and Warren. The top 4 vote-getters being Marshall, Story, Holmes, and Cardozo. In Who Are the Great Justices and What Criteria Did They Meet?, the lead essay in William Peterson and Norman Provider's Great Justices of the Supreme Court, Professor Bradley presents sundry great justices tables depicting the ratings by various groups of experts and lay observers of the court. They are remarkably similar in their judgment, reconfirming the above described consensus. Thus, his own list of the 10 greats, based on elected responses from scholars in the judicial process, show first Marshall, second Holmes, third Warren, fourth Brandeis, 5 Brennan, 6 Black, 7 Harlan, 8 Douglas, 9 Frankfurter, and 10 Cardozo. The liberal giants Brennan and Douglas being noted elevations to the top 10, they had been in the near great category. According to responding judges, a much smaller participating universe, the top 10 as of 1992, as seen by the judges, were 1 Marshall, 2 Holmes, 3 Cardozo, 4 Brandeis, 5 Warren, 6 Black, 7 Frankfurter, 8 Brennan, 9 Douglas, and 10 Taft. Attorneys, a far more numerous group of respondents than the judges, chose 1 Marshall, 2 Holmes, 3 Brandeis, 4 Cardozo, 5 Frankfurter, 6 Warren, 7 Douglas, 8 Black, 9 Tawney, and a triple tie for the 10th slot, Story, John Marshall Harlan II, and Rehnquist. A current group of students advanced, not surprisingly, a rather different roster of ad hominem preferences. 1 John Marshall, 2 Rehnquist, 3 O'Connor, 4 Berger, 5 Warren, 6 Brennan, 7 Holmes, 8 Blackman, 9 Thurgood Marshall, and 10 Black. Now, appearing on all of the above compendia were 4. John Marshall, Holmes, Black, and Warren. 3, Brandeis, Cardozo, and Frankfurter appeared on all but the students. Now you will notice that Jackson was not listed by anyone, and I'll come to that in a moment. Most recently, Professor Michael Comiskey elucidated the results of his survey, which he limited to the 52 justices appointed in the 20th century, beginning with Holmes and ending with Breyer. 200 constitutional law scholars were asked to rank the 52 on a 5-point scale ranging from excellent to failure. The 61 who responded categorized 11 as excellent. Transposing excellent into great for our purposes provides the following results. 1 and 2 a tie, Holmes and Brandeis, 3 Cardozo, 4 Brennan, 5 Harlan II, 6 Warren, 7 and 8 Hughes and Black, 9 Stone, 10 Frankfurter, and 11 Robert Jackson. His only listing as great among all the published ratings, arguably a distinct injustice. Instead, the court historians and observers have opted to recognize Robert Jackson's achievements as near great. His tenure was not an entirely happy one. He had wanted to be Chief Justice. Tragically, his path was blocked in considerable measure by the doctrinal and personal feud with Hugo Black. Largely because of Jackson's strong feelings, some of their controversy was unfortunately carried on in public, harming Jackson far more than Black and exacerbating Chief Justice Stone's problems in maintaining a harmonious court. Jackson's acceptance of President Truman's request in 1945 to become the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials and his subsequent absence from the court for an entire term compounded his difficulties with his colleagues, not to mention the business of the court, which had to operate with 8 justices and the attendant all-too-present danger of 4 to 4 votes, of which there were a score. And when there's a tie, 4-4, the highest decision in the lower courts will govern. Very unsatisfactory arrangement, and Justice Black took particularly umbrage with that situation. Jackson was brilliant in Nuremberg, notwithstanding some critics, such a recent one in the person of John Wheeler Bennett. Yet Jackson returned from the trials a different man. The once liberal judicial activist who had so often sided with Black Douglas, Murphy, and Rutledge had become profoundly cautious, a markedly narrow interpreter of the Bill of Rights, especially in criminal justice cases. He now, more often than not, sided with the Felix Frankfurter wing of the court, which took a generally restrictive stand in matters affecting national security and state criminal justice procedures. This intriguing metamorphosis may well have resulted from his Nuremberg experiences, his first-hand perception of the melancholy events resulting in the destruction of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism. It was his conclusive judgment, one that I join, whatever it may be worth, that one of the major contributory factors was the failure of the Weimar government to crack down on radical dissenters and extremist groups, which is why Jackson exhorted his colleagues in his famous Term the Yellow Dissent in 1949 that they beware lest they convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact, end quote. Yet Jackson remained an apostle of judicial restraint in the economic proprietarian sphere, supporting governmental authority to regulate and thus remaining true to his basic New Deal commitments. He was ever conscious of and preoccupied with the limits of both judicial capacity and judicial power. He was a student of judicial power and authority. And even if there were no other justification for holding Jackson in high esteem as a jurist, his magnificent prose, second in beauty and clarity, perhaps only to that of Benjamin Cardozo, has earned him the nation's high regard and gratitude. Who could ever forget the haunting beauty of his phrases, such as those in his memorable opinion striking down the West Virginia flag salute in 1943? Those who begin coercive elimination of dissent will soon find themselves eliminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard, end quote. And he elaborated, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matter of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw a certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. One's right to life, to liberty, and to property, to free speech, to free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. On October the 9th, 1954, an untimely death came to Robert Jackson when he succumbed to a heart attack en route to the court. That May, he had still participated in the court's unanimously decided momentous public school desegregation cases. In some ways, Robert Jackson died a bitter and disappointed man, never having attained the coveted court leadership, but he left a legacy as America's advocate. It is a pity that none of the sparse number of biographies that have addressed the career or careers of America's advocate have accorded him full justice. Yet they're quite properly as one in agreeing, in the words of Professor Glendon Schubert, whose book called Dispassionate Justice, published in 1969, represents a synthesis of Jackson's opinions on the Supreme Court that, quote, more than any other Supreme Court justice in the 20th century, Robert Jackson was the voice of the bar, speaking from the bench. He was a lawyer of and for lawyers. He would very likely have seconded Chief Justice Taft's often quoted celebration of the judicial legal universe, namely, as Taft put it, I love judges and I love courts. They are my ideals on earth, or what we shall meet afterwards in heaven under a just God. He was so happy to be Chief Justice. He had spawned for that position. God was with him. People died when they were supposed to, and Taft attained the Chief Justiceship. He only was allowed 9 years, and he died fighting death because he didn't want to leave. I hope he wound up in heaven. In any event, Justice Jackson might have skipped the second sentence, namely, about heaven under God, and quoted with approval his friend and colleague Felix Frankfurter, who commented on the Taft statement, quote, that Taft had a very different notion of heaven than any I know anything about. Felix had a big mouth, but he was a superb jurist and a very interesting person. He could also be very nasty. When he heard that Chief Justice Vinson had suffered a fatal coronary thrombosis, he said, until now I never knew there was a God. That's one of his more lovely attributes. Yet Jackson's love of the law and those who would adjudicate and interpret it did not fail to recognize the latter's limits in our constitutional universe, limits that he frequently addressed. Thus he noted in his posthumously published Godkin Lectures on the Essentials of Free Government and the Duties of the Citizen, that while the Supreme Court at the zenith of the judiciary manifests the triad of legal, governmental, and political characteristics and functions, and now I quote, however well the court and its bar may discharge their tasks, the destiny of this court is inseparably linked to the fate of our democratic system of representative government, end quote. Robert Jackson was an abiding Democrat, uppercase D, but he was even more of a Democrat, lowercase, one whose passion was the verbiage, the commands of the written Constitution. He was no friend of legislative forays by judges. He was a demonstrable devotee of judicial restraint, just like Justice Frankfurter and John Marshall Harlan II, who succeeded Jackson on the court. Judicial activism was for him irreconcilable with representative democracy. Essentially, Justice Jackson's jurisprudence on the high bench was centrist, ever mindful of the court's constitutional parameters of authority and power. Basically a moderate, he was not comfortable with the often predictable jurisprudence of the 4 liberal justices who served with him during much of his tenure, namely Black, Douglas, Murphy, and Rutledge, notwithstanding his passionate embrace of the Bill of Rights. It was an embrace that, for example, saw him join his colleagues Roberts and Murphy in descending from the 6-member majority in the traumatic 1944 Japanese evacuation case of Korematsu versus the United States, with Jackson exhorting, quote, now, if any fundamental assumption underlies our system, it is that guilt is personal and not inheritable, end quote. And that embrace, to cite another famous opinion, prompted his majority opinion for the 6-3 court in the 1943 ruling of West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, striking down West Virginia's compulsory flag salute, his elegant, majestic pen, reminding the polity that, and I've quoted it before, but you will forgive me if I quote it again, those who begin compulsory elimination of dissent will soon find themselves eliminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard, end quote. Yet that embrace of the Bill of Rights in all its aspects did not blind Jackson to drawing lines and pointing to limits when that seemed appropriate. He became acutely conscious of that necessary task following his Nuremberg experience, evidently concluding that governments who wish to remain free must take a stand against certain subversive activity lest they perish, as did Germany's Weimar Republic. Hence, in one of his most famous dissents, he joined Justices Frankfurter and Burton and Chief Justice Vinson in unsuccessfully pleading to uphold Chicago's attempts to harness the mob incitement of American fascist leader Gerald L.K. Smith, concluding memorably, and I quote, "The choice is not between order and liberty. The choice is between liberty with order and anarchy without order. There is danger that if this court does not temper its doctrinaire logic with a little practical wisdom, it will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact." A case could be made for the contention that the post-Nuremberg Jackson, ladies and gentlemen, was a new Jackson, a more conservative or a less liberal one than the pre-Nuremberg Jackson. I've been among those who have been tempted to make that case, but I have begun to recognize that if such a change can in fact be documented, it is but a very marginable one, be it in the civil rights and liberties realm or in that of the economic proprietarian sphere. The self-made country lawyer's lawyer was both an economic conservative and a champion of individual liberty. He was profoundly committed to a basic creed of leaving people alone, but he did not support a jurisprudential policy of writing personal visions of correct policy into law. Thus he viewed as a legislative branch task in concert with the executive branch. Robert Jackson remained true to judicial restraint, which encompassed his conviction that the court's role should not be viewed as a panacea for every blot upon the public welfare, nor should the court, as fellow judicial restraint champion John Marshall Harlan II urged in joining similarly motivated Felix Frankfurter in a memorable dissenting opinion in Baker v. Carr, the famous 1962 one-man vote decision, nor should the court, and I quote, be thought of as a general haven for reform movements, end quote. To a considerable degree, Jackson's jurisprudence found disciples in such contemporary centrist jurists on the Supreme Court as Lewis Powell and Sandra O'Connor. In fine, Jackson's legacy is highlighted by his principled judicial restraint in all phases of the appellate judicial process, his soaring, magnificent penmanship of the 300-plus opinions he wrote, and he wrote them all by himself, and his leadership in establishing a world law code that rendered the making of war as an international crime and established a multinational tribunal to conduct trials involving crimes of war, with his brilliant performance in Nuremberg pointing the way. That was an echo in some of the things that President Bush said last night. Robert Jackson may have been rated only near great by the professional observers, but his influence in the evolving judicial governmental process remains towering. Thank you very much.
Professor Abraham, you've filled in, as we've attempted to do throughout the Robert Jackson Center, part of understand the mosaic of Robert Jackson, and you are the first, and I think probably will be the best, to provide us with a sense of scholarship and the judicial scholarship of Robert Jackson, and for that we'll be eternally grateful. So thank you very much.